A young girl sat inside a large cavern and pulled at the yellow peel of a small fruit to reveal the translucent sweet pulp inside. She popped the eyeball-like treat into her mouth. Next to her, her younger cousin held the creamy flesh of a palm fruit in her hand. They both felt the cool breeze that made this place a refuge from the heat outside. After eating a bit more, the two girls decided to look for something to do. Nearby, their mothers worked by a campfire. One scraped meat from turtle bones with a thick stone tool. The other braided dry gray plant fiber into string. The girls didn't want to get roped into tending the fire, so they avoided eye contact and scurried toward the entrance of the cave, where something more exciting was happening. Two men were returning to camp, carrying the carcass of a massive pirarucu. It was 2 meters long and weighed more than either man. One side of the fish bore several gashes where triangular stone spear points had inflicted fatal injuries. The girls looked with amazement at the giant creature, which would feed their group for several days. After their excitement died down, the girls escaped again, this time toward the back of the cave. Here, they entered a dark, narrow passage where they could just barely make out paintings on the wall. As their eyes adjusted to the dark, the older cousin began telling stories based on the drawings of people confronting snakes and crocodiles. These tales had been told to her when she was younger, and they conveyed important lessons. Although they didn't know it, these paintings connected them to people living across a large portion of South America. These girls lived 12,400 years ago along the lower stretches of the Amazon River. The triangular spear points of the men, the thick stone tools of the women, and the detailed cave paintings all reveal long-distance cultural links to other hunter-gatherer societies far to the west and south. These were defining elements of some early South American cultures, which were becoming increasingly diverse as the end of the Pleistocene arrived. Welcome to Our Prehistory, Episode 42, Fishtail Points and Early South America. During the migration of humans from Asia to America, the Beringian land bridge acted like a bottleneck, limiting which aspects of culture, genetics, language, and technology were present among the colonists of America. We saw last time that the earliest cultures of North America exhibited a Siberian heritage, but with certain traditions lost and others added. In the same way, the narrowness of the Central American isthmus constrained the movement of people into South America, and as we will see today, this dispersal southward further diluted and transformed the Eurasian legacy. The oldest South American cultures, of which we have a clear understanding, retained some similarities to early cultures in North America, such as Clovis and the Western stemmed tradition. However, passing through the tropics meant that people encountered new obstacles to survival and were forced to quickly adapt to different ecosystems. What resulted was an incredibly diverse South American cultural landscape. This variety materialized in the archaeological record between 13,000 and 12,000 years ago, and can be seen in the way hunter-gatherers made stone tools, and in their foraging strategies. In this episode, we will try to decipher the surprisingly complex process of South American colonization and examine the range of human life that arose as societies started to become more settled. The origin of early South American cultures relates closely to the different biomes found on this continent. As in Eurasia and Sahul, humans were incredibly adept at quickly colonizing radically distinct environments, from the dry Pacific coast to the cold Andes Mountains, the wet forests of the Amazon basin, the drier savannas and grasslands of the center, and the frigid steppe and tundra of the south. Within each of these places, unique human societies developed before the end of the Pleistocene. In addition to this ecological explanation, another factor may have contributed to early cultural differentiation. Genetic and archaeological evidence reveal that multiple migratory waves of people passed through the Central American isthmus within a few millennia of human arrival. The movement of separate groups of people into South America at different times, carrying distinct cultural practices, may have contributed to the mosaic of traditions that appeared. From an archaeological perspective, if there was a single group of people with a uniform set of traditions that entered South America and spread rapidly across the continent, we would expect to encounter evidence of dominant pan-South American customs around the time they arrived. But this is not exactly what we find. Instead, it seems that at least two different cultures were coexisting by 13,000 years ago. One of these probably arrived around 15,000 years ago and is best represented by the Monteverde site in southern Chile. The people who lived at this semi-sedentary camp mostly made simple stone tools, which lacked intentional shaping. Importantly, these flakes were only modified on a single face of the stone, and so are called unifacial. Unifacial tools could be made quickly and with many different types of rock. This unifacial toolkit was used by people inhabiting several parts of the continent between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago. Their camps have been found in Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. Interestingly, these early colonists, including those at Monteverde, possessed the knowledge and skill to create bifacial points, such as the thick, long, narrow hobo points from Venezuela and Chile, but they left behind only rare examples. This primarily unifacial tradition was joined by a second and more distinctive culture that appeared in South America around 13,000 years ago, and which was characterized by stone points shaped like fish. Skillfully crafted and usually about 5 to 8 centimeters long, they had stems shaped like fish tails. These so-called fish tail points have been found in every region of the continent, representing the most widespread style of South American stone point to ever exist. Some archaeologists believe that the practice of making these points arrived with a secondary wave of human migration into South America through the Central American Isthmus by a group carrying a set of customs distinct from those of the earlier unifacial tradition. We will examine the specific archaeological arguments for this theory in a minute, but first, let's take a look at whether the current genetic data supports this two-wave hypothesis. The oldest human DNA sequences from South America came from Lagoa Santa in southeastern Brazil and Los Rieles in central Chile. These individuals lived between 11,000 and 10,400 years ago. Unfortunately, that's more than 2,000 years after the appearance of fishtail points. Yet, their genetic code still reveals a key piece of information. Both share a close genetic affinity to a person who lived in North America, a child buried with Clovis points at the Anzick site in Wyoming 12,800 years ago. The closeness of this genetic link between North and South Americans living more than 10,000 years ago is evidence for a rapid expansion of certain groups of humans, most likely originating in North America. Interestingly, the presence of Anzick ancestry in South America would be short-lived. Starting 9,000 years ago, people closely related to the Anzick child began disappearing, as another genetic lineage came to dominate the continent, a group from whom all modern-day indigenous South Americans are descended. The presence of two genetically distinct populations during the early Holocene means that at least two separate migratory waves of people arrived from North America, one at some time before 11,000 years ago, and the other more than 9,000 years ago. Unfortunately, we don't have any DNA from people living during the Fishtail period or earlier, so we can't say precisely when these dispersals occurred and how they relate to the Fishtail and unifacial cultural traditions, which were both present in South America by 13,000 years ago. Some have proposed that the people living at Lagoa Santa and Los Rieles were descended from Fishtail Point users who themselves were closely related to Clovis. This theory remains unproven, but it comes from the fact that Fishtail points appeared just as the Clovis period was starting, possibly a hint that these cultural phenomenon were linked. Also, around 13,200 years ago, the number of archaeological sites in South America increased dramatically, just as they did in North America, suggesting a simultaneous increase in the human population, possibly related to the same wave of migration. This brings us back again to the archaeology, from which we can draw further connections between fishtail culture and North America. First, fishtail points were not exclusively used in South America. They have also been found across Central America, including in Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and southern Mexico, and across southeastern United States, in Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, where they were called Simpson or Suwannee points. Second, everywhere that fishtail points were made by early Americans, they were fluted, at least occasionally, just like Clovis points, meaning that they had long, narrow flakes removed from their bases, leaving behind a channel or flute. Importantly, this stoneworking technique was never used on any other continent besides America. It's highly unlikely that such a specific technique was invented independently in North and South America. So the practice of fluting must have spread amongst Clovis and fishtail cultures, either by migrations of hunter-gatherer bands or by repeated sharing of this concept between neighboring groups. However, the nature of these cultural relationships and the origin of fishtail points remains intensely debated. One theory is that fishtail points evolved from Clovis points among groups of people living in Central America or southeastern United States, whose descendants then migrated into South America. This idea is supported by the fact that in Central America, people used fishtail and wasted Clovis points around the same time. Wasted Clovis points are essentially intermediate in shape between classic Clovis and fishtail points. Central America may have been the place where this technological transition occurred. Unfortunately, sites with these types of stone tools in Central America and southeastern United States are undated. In South America, the oldest fishtail points are 13,000 years old, essentially the same or maybe slightly younger than the oldest Clovis points in North America, so it's hard to use chronology to trace the geographic spread of different varieties of fluted points. The idea that fishtail culture evolved from Clovis among migrants on their way to South America makes for a nice, tidy story, but not all archaeologists agree. Some experts point out, correctly, that the vast majority of fishtail points have been found in the southern cone of South America, in the pampas of Argentina, Uruguay, and southern Brazil, and the far southern region of Patagonia. In other parts of South America, fishtail points are much rarer and appear to be the result of short-lived human occupations. So they argue that the core of fishtail culture and its likely origin is in the south. They propose that Central America might have been a cultural interaction zone where Clovis and fishtail peoples coexisted and shared stone spear point traditions, including the fluting technique. While the relationship between Clovis and fishtail points remains murky, the parallels between the events in North and South America are remarkable. Both continents saw a dramatic growth in the human population, or at least in the number of archaeological sites around 13,000 years ago. Simultaneously, both witnessed the appearance and dramatic spread of skillfully napped and standardized bifacial point styles among people living across a large proportion of the continent. No other prehistoric custom would ever come to rival the geographic extent of Clovis or fishtail points. Whether these similarities were directly related to the same wave of human migration, or due to similar social and environmental circumstances across the Americas, it's clear that the early phases of human colonization favored uniquely expansive cultures. Not too long after the appearance of fishtail points, several other less extensive stone-tooled traditions emerged in South America, each reflecting adaptations to local environments. Some groups became expert foragers of marine and coastal resources. Others learned how to live in hot rainforests and savannas, on the high plateaus of the Andes, or on the flat pampas grasslands. Some of these cultures likely descended from the people who used fishtail points, or unifacial tools. Their origins are hard to decipher, but they demonstrate that even before the end of the Ice Age, South American cultures were surprisingly distinct from each other, even possessing unique ritual behaviors. In the remainder of this episode, we will take a tour of the continent and examine this variety, beginning with the fishtail culture of the southern cone of the continent. The practice of making stone spear points with fishtail-shaped stems absolutely dominated the hunter-gatherer societies south of the 22nd parallel, especially to the east of the Andes, an enormous area including southern Brazil, Uruguay, and most of Argentina and Chile. From what is now Sao Paulo to Tierra del Fuego, 4,000 kilometers to the south, hunter-gatherers constructed spears with fish-tailed points. This culture emerged around 13,000 years ago, and within 300 years had reached the southern tip of the continent. Fish-tail points remained in use for about 2,000 years in this region, much longer than Clovis points in North America. This area where fishtail culture thrived was covered by temperate steppe in the north and colder steppe and tundra in the south. These plains supported many large herbivores. In fact, this part of the continent supported a larger diversity of now extinct megafauna than any other region in South America. This environment mirrors the mammoth steppe of the northern hemisphere, and the lifeway that developed in the southern cone parallels that of Clovis on the Great Plains. First, there is a clear orientation toward hunting large animals. Refuse discovered at the camps of fishtail peoples consistently includes the bones of extinct American horses, mastodon, and quite prominently, giant ground sloth, which weighed up to 2 tons. Alongside megafauna, they also hunted medium-sized animals like deer, rhea, a large flightless bird related to ostrich, and guanaco, one of the American camel species and the wild ancestor of domesticated llamas. Second, they used stone tools that were clearly designed for the processing of large animal carcasses. Their stemmed points were initially used as hunting weapons, but were often repurposed as knives. Many fishtail groups made blades using complex core preparation. These long, narrow tools likely functioned as butchery knives. Interestingly, blades became less common after the disappearance of fishtail culture, much like after the end of Clovis in North America. Fishtail people also made unifacial scrapers in a variety of shapes, many of which were likely used to clean animal hides. Finally, they used notched flakes and gravers, and sometimes made bone spear points, foreshafts, and awls, much like in the early cultures of North America. This was a specialized toolkit, resembling that of the Western stem tradition and Clovis. Interestingly, this complex set of stone and bone tools was not used in the American tropics between the temperate grasslands of North and South America, suggesting that when fishtail people arrived in the Pampas and Patagonia, they reinvented several tool types of their northern relatives. Although needles, like those of Clovis and the Western stem traditions, have not been found among the remains of fishtail camps. Regardless, in the southern cone we find another example of a theme repeated often in prehistory, the theme of hunter-gatherer societies successfully colonizing cold, open landscapes by investing in relatively complex stone and bone tool technology. Another similarity with the Clovis people of the Great Plains was the extent to which they moved across the landscape. Several instances of long-distance transport of stone have been identified. For example, fishtail groups carried high-quality stone more than 500 kilometers from what is today Uruguay into Argentina. This mobile lifestyle was likely related to the pursuit of large prey, which tend to be more scattered across the landscape than small animals. One way in which our understanding of fishtail culture differs from that of Clovis is that in ritual behaviors. In fact, we know more about fishtail symbolic practices than we do about those of Clovis people. For example, fishtail spear points were imparted with special significance. Those who made them were highly selective in the type of stone used to craft these weapons, often favoring especially colorful varieties. Furthermore, while fishtail points were usually between 5 and 8 centimeters long, several exceptionally large and small specimens have been found, more than 15 centimeters and less than 2 centimeters long, respectively. These were not functional spear points. The miniatures may have been toys, and the large ones may have been items of prestige made by exceptionally skilled knappers. Other than stone points, 2 other mysterious artifact types found at several fishtail sites in Argentina may have held symbolic value. Small stones shaped as spheres and discs. Whether these were ornaments, ritual items, or tools for processing plants is unclear, although it should be noted that the small spheres are identical to some of those found at Monteverde in Chile. Those are about 2,000 years older and notably were interpreted as components of hunting weapons. However, some experts favor a symbolic interpretation for the spheres and discs because they have been found at 2 important ritual sites. These were hilltops with commanding views of the surrounding plains. Known as Amigo Oeste and Sombrero, these hills are located 900 kilometers apart from each other in Argentina, but reveal remarkably similar behaviors. At the top of both hills, people discarded dozens of broken fishtail points, among other stone tools, spheres, and discs. It's thought that they transported spearheads broken in use elsewhere to these high points on the landscape as some kind of meaningful act, which again reinforces the significance attributed by these people to their hunting weapons, the objects used to kill the largest animals of the plains. And it's with the decline of these creatures that we find a final striking parallel between Clovis and fishtail cultures. Between 12,900 and 11,600 years ago, the megafauna populations of the southern cone of South America fell rapidly, and several species went extinct, including those hunted by humans. We will get into the details of this decline next episode, but for now, let's focus on the fact that, as in North America, megafauna extinctions coincided with cultural transition. The number of fishtail camps peaked around 12,400 years ago, and quickly decreased after this date. In fact, in Patagonia, the southernmost part of the continent, it seems that the size of the human population crashed after the disappearance of fishtail culture, suggesting that humans were not able to survive in this tundra without megafauna to hunt. The earliest prehistory of North and South America witnessed human ways of life that depended heavily on the exploitation of large animals. When the numbers of these animals collapsed dramatically, cultural shifts took place. Megafauna extinctions occurred slightly earlier in North America than in South America, perhaps explaining why fishtail points remained in use longer than Clovis points. In both places, people had to reorient their hunting approach, a process which had knock-on effects, such as the emergence of new weapon types. After the decline of fishtail culture across the southern cone, smaller varieties of stone points appeared, more appropriate for smaller prey. And just as with the end of Clovis, fishtail points were replaced by several different local styles. Cultural regionalisation characterized post-Clovis and post-fishtail America. Explosive expansion and uniformity were followed by readjustment and diversity. Between 13,000 and 12,000 years ago, megafauna hunting was central to human life in the Pampas and Patagonia. But along the western edge of the continent, more generalized and diverse forms of foraging emerged. On the Pacific coast and in the Andes Mountains, people sometimes hunted megafauna, like mastodon and horse, but they ate other types of food more frequently than in the southern cone, including marine resources, small animals, and plants. This economic variety was matched by the emergence of diverse cultural groups, identified today by the types of stone tools they used. The Pacific coast of South America at the time was slightly more humid than today. The Colombian coast was covered in rainforest. Moving south, the climate became drier. Dry seasonal forests, mangroves, and marshes gave way to arid scrub and desert. Here, some groups of hunter-gatherers came to depend greatly on coastal resources, including food from the ocean and wetlands. The remains of several seaside camps in Ecuador, Peru, and Chile contain the remains of shellfish, fish, and crustaceans. At two sites in Peru, people camped and cooked small marine drumfish, wedge clams, and seabirds, including cormorant and booby. The abundance of small fish implies the use of nets for fishing, a sophisticated technology within hunter-gatherer societies, and a sign that these South Americans had developed a specialized marine adaptation by about 13,000 years ago. Although it's unclear to what extent these groups depended solely on coastal aquatic ecosystems. Interestingly, organic artifacts belonging to Western South Americans of this time have survived. At sites more than 12,000 years old, in the mountains of Peru and the lowlands of northern Chile, fiber artifacts, including fragments of delicately crafted string and woven mats or bags, were discovered. These were made from the leaves of agave and bromeliad plants, and the skills needed to make them could have been applied to making fishing nets. The marine specialists of the Pacific coast lived contemporaneously with people making camps further inland, on the coastal plains and in the mountains. However, it's unknown whether coastal and inland camps belonged to distinct cultural groups. It's difficult to tell because the stone tools left behind at coastal camps were always simple and expedient, falling within the unifacial tradition but lacking culturally identifying forms. There's some evidence that people moved between the coast and mountains. At a couple coastal sites in Peru where fishing was practiced, people used stone tools made from obsidian. This type of stone had been collected from a source in the Andes, about 150 kilometers inland and 2,800 meters above sea level. They either traded with people who lived in the mountains, or their nomadic movements took them far from the coast at times. In Chile, obsidian was also carried from the mountains down to lower elevation sites, and marine shells were carried 70 kilometers inland. This movement suggests that some forager bands utilized diverse subsistence strategies at different times of the year. This idea is further supported by the fact that some of the groups living inland used similar unifacial stone tools as those on the coast. For example, some of the oldest known camps in the mountains of Colombia belonged to people who hunted deer, small rodents, and occasionally megafauna, but apparently did so with a simple stone toolkit. The affiliation of groups using simple unifacial tools remains mysterious. However, not all hunter-gatherers living between 13,000 and 12,000 years ago in Western South America were so culturally ambiguous. Some made unique types of stone points, all of which were bifacially knapped, reflecting the key technological legacy of the first people to reach the Americas. Furthermore, many of these were stemmed, suggesting a possible link to fishtail cultures. One of these point types was used in the Magdalena River Valley of Colombia, a key corridor of human movement into Amazonia and into the higher elevations of the Andes. Around 12,400 years ago, a culture appeared in this narrow river valley whose people made triangular points with narrow stems. These were not fluted, nor were their stems shaped like fishtails. Along with these, they made carefully shaped unifacial scrapers and less uniform flake tools. We know little about this culture other than the fact that they used the resources of this valley, probably from lowland forests, rivers, and savannas. Another clearly defined culture emerged in northern Peru, around 12,800 years ago. Here, in the dry forest of the Andean foothills, people began making a type of spearhead named paihan points, which ranged from 5 to 15 centimeters long. They were highly standardized, bifacial, unfluted, and narrow-stemmed, not unlike those of the Magdalena Valley. What set paihan points apart from other types was their extended narrow tip, which was described as needle-pointed. This feature was quite rare among Paleolithic cultures globally, and some archaeologists have speculated that this needle-point design was ideal for fishing spears. Paihan points have been found at sites outside of Peru in northern Chile, and here there's evidence that hunters propelled their spears using spear throwers, also called atlatls. We know this because a 3-centimeter cylindrical piece of wood with a circular notch at its base was preserved in the arid environment of the Atacama Desert. This artifact is interpreted as the base of a spear shaft crafted to fit into the hook of a spear thrower. This device, separate from the spear, effectively extends the length of the human arm, increasing the strength with which a spear can be thrown. This is one of those rare artifacts, like the oldest boomerangs of southern Australia, the oldest arrows from Germany, and the spear thrower hooks from France, which provide invaluable direct evidence of Paleolithic hunting technology and strategy. This notched piece of wood from the Atacama shows us that South Americans used spear throwers, a technology which would have made the hunting of megafauna more efficient, and which is often thought to have been widespread among Clovis and Fishtail peoples, based on the size of their spear points. However, the people of the Paihan culture were neither megafauna hunters nor marine specialists. They exploited a wide range of food resources, including fish from coastal lagoons, foxes, lizards, deer, wild pigs, chinchillas, and snails. Grinding stones at their camps suggest that plants that required processing made up an important part of their diet. They used only local types of stone, suggesting that they did not migrate into the mountains as part of their nomadic ranging. Interestingly, they coexisted in the Andean foothills with people using fishtail points for at least a few centuries. But Paihan culture outlasted that of fishtail people in this part of South America by 2,000 years. Paihan points remained in use until 9,600 years ago. Further inland, another distinct culture formed in the higher elevations of the Andes Mountains. It took longer for humans to colonize these highlands than it did the Pacific coast. When humans first arrived in South America, glaciers covered large portions of the mountain range between Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. This was about 15,000 years ago if we accept the pre-Clovis, or more appropriately, pre-Fishtail scenario. But by about 12,400 years ago, these glaciers had retreated substantially, making the highlands much more hospitable to forager bands, who began living there permanently. Starting around that date, several camps appeared between 2,000 and 4,500 meters above sea level from Ecuador to Chile. Camps belonging to what archaeologists have called the Central Andean hunting tradition. The people of this culture followed a seasonal way of life, migrating between the cold grasslands of highland plateaus and forests of lower elevation intermontane valleys. They hunted deer, camelids, and rodents, and collected plants. The tools of this Andean highland culture reveal a clear orientation to hunting. Stone scrapers and bone awls were common at their camps, and would have been crucial for processing animal hides to make warm clothing. Their hunting weapons were tipped by bifacial stone points, which were usually not stemmed and quite variable in shape, including laurel leaf, diamond, and triangular forms. This Central Andean hunting tradition, like the Paihan culture, lasted for about 3,000 years and continued well into the Holocene. But these were only two of several cultures that emerged in western South America during the final centuries of the Pleistocene. They were part of a larger trend. Hunter-gatherer bands were beginning to form more stable, settled societies than those of their ancestors. Whether those forebears had belonged to the continent-wide unifacial or fishtail traditions is unknown. But during this period, About 3 millennia after the arrival of the first pioneers to South America, strong bonds between people and land were forming, and local identity was becoming increasingly important. The ability to nap bifacial spear points represents the most obvious technological legacy of the colonization of South America by North Americans. But in one region of the continent, the imprint of this heritage was faint. For some reason, the early inhabitants of eastern South America mostly rejected the bifacial technique. The rarity of this custom makes the early societies of this region unique within the Americas, a distinctiveness which again demonstrates the rapid emergence of cultural variation on this continent, and reveals the development of lifeways specific to warm, tropical climates. For our purposes, eastern South America includes the Amazon River Basin and further south, central Brazil. At the time that humans arrived in South America, continuous forest did not cover the Amazon Basin, as it mostly does today. Due to the drier climate of the Ice Age, the region was a natural mosaic of forest and savanna. A savanna that extended south into central Brazil, where it mixed with dry, thorny woodland. In the Amazon Basin and central Brazil, people seldom used fishtail points. Only 7 sites with this type of hunting weapon have been found here, whereas in southern Brazil, a much smaller area, they have been discovered at dozens of locations. It seems that fishtail people only made short-lived incursions into the savannas, woodlands, and forests of eastern South America. But this doesn't mean that humans were absent from this region during the fishtail period. In fact, in central Brazil, a distinct culture emerged around 12,500 years ago, known as the Itaparica tradition. Following the trend seen in other parts of South America, this culture began during the final centuries of the Pleistocene and lasted for several thousand years, well into the Holocene. Within this tradition, no standardized stone points of any type were used. This might be related to the fact that they tended to hunt small and medium-sized animals, such as brocket deer, rhea birds, lizards, armadillos, and guinea pigs. They also fished and collected mollusks. Interestingly, evidence for megafauna hunting in central Brazil is less common than in other parts of the continent. Perhaps wooden hunting weapons and snares sufficed for catching small animals, whereas stone spear points were unnecessarily time-consuming and complex. Interestingly, the people of the Itaparica tradition did spend time napping one type of standardized stone tool, a tool which is used to identify archaeological sites belonging to these groups. Known today as lesmas, the name for this culturally defining artifact comes from the Portuguese word for slug, an animal that reflects the shape of these stone tools. Lesmas were large and thick, ranging between 7 and 15 centimeters long and 2 to 5 centimeters wide. Notably flat on one face and rounded on the other, they were shaped by removing chips around the entire margin of the tool. Sometimes pointed at one end, lesmas were multifunctional, carefully crafted, and maintained over extended periods. They were probably used for scraping, and starch grains found on one specimen suggest they sometimes served to process plant food. While the absence of bifacial points within the Itaparica tradition distinguishes it from other early South American cultures, the use of lesmas links it to other regions of the continent. Lesmas were central to other Pleistocene age cultures outside of central Brazil, including that of the Magdalena Valley in Colombia and the Paihan of Peru. They have also been found in Central America, the Amazon Basin, and southern Brazil. Their broad distribution is not surprising. Lesmas were essentially standardized and more carefully napped versions of unifacial tools that were ubiquitous at the camps of the first South Americans. Therefore, they could have been invented anywhere on the continent, perhaps even multiple times, before spreading and becoming widespread. It's noteworthy that lesmas became most common among the hunter-gatherers inhabiting the tropics. This brings to mind an interesting parallel with tropical Southeast Asia, where Sumatraliths became the only defining tool of the Pleistocene Hoabinhian tradition, much like lesmas are in the Itaparica tradition. Sumatraliths were also thick tools, flat on one side, rounded on the other, and unifacially retouched along the entire margin. This case of technological convergence might reflect the need for this specific type of tool in tropical environments. Sumatraliths were theorized to have been woodworking tools, but their true function and that of lesmas remains to be discovered. North of the Itaparica tradition, we find the Amazon basin, the region of South America with the fewest sites dated to the Pleistocene. The dense forest covering this region today has made the discovery of archaeological remains difficult. As a result, we know little about the initial colonization by humans of its prehistoric forests and savannas, but two well-studied sites reveal fascinating insights. They show that the first humans living in the Amazon, of which we are aware, used a wide range of resources, including from forests and rivers. First, in eastern Amazonia, at a cave known as Pedra Pintada, people lived starting around 12,400 years ago and collected several types of nuts and fruits from rainforest trees, including palm fruits and Brazil nuts. They also gathered freshwater mussels and hunted turtles, rodents, birds, and reptiles. And notably, they were prolific fishers who caught several species, from small wolffish and catfish to, incredibly, one of the largest freshwater fish in the world, the enormous 2-meter-long pirarucu. Interestingly, these groups made lesmas and bifacial triangular stemmed points, similar to those found in the Magdalena River Valley of Colombia, suggesting that the early inhabitants of the Amazon shared long-distance cultural similarities with others in the north of the continent. Around the same time, at the other end of the Amazon basin, at a rock shelter in Lindosa, Colombia, people hunted and gathered a similar range of plant foods and animals, including nuts, fruits, fish, capybara, turtles, snakes, and crocodiles. These remarkable findings show that these early Amazonians already had a deep understanding of the many plants and animals available to them and developed a way of life centered on riverine corridors. The extensive exploitation of plants seen at Lindosa and Pedra Pintada was not an isolated practice within South America at this time. We also saw evidence of this in the grinding stones of the Paihan culture and the 73 plant species collected at Monteverde in southern Chile. Further evidence for the importance of plant food during the Pleistocene has been discovered in the mountains of western Colombia. Here, hunter-gatherers living around 12,000 years ago hunted animals with bifacial points shaped like laurel leaves, but they also frequently used grinding stones to process plant foods. At one camp, a wide range of plant remains was discovered, including seeds of wild avocado and starch grains of arrowroot, manioc, and sweet potato. These Colombian groups also used stone axes and hoes. Some even had ground edges, suggesting that they were valued tools. This custom in tropical Colombia mirrors the earliest cultures of New Guinea and Australia, where stone axes were also used, possibly to clear patches of forest to promote the growth of edible plants. Much like ancient Sahulians, South Americans of the Pleistocene foraged plant foods extensively and might have been modifying the environment to their favor. Just as in New Guinea, subtle signs foreshadowing the emergence of agriculture first appeared in hunter-gatherer societies of the terminal Pleistocene. Several of the plant species foraged during this period would go on to be domesticated in South America within 2,000 to 4,000 years, during the early Holocene. Beyond the foraging behaviors of early South Americans, the earliest Amazonian sites also provide rare insights into the oldest American art. At Lindosa and Pedra Pintada, the archaeological remains were found next to red rock paintings, and discoveries of pigments in dated deposits suggest that the practice of decorating cave walls started during the Pleistocene. At Lindosa, the paintings include an incredibly diverse array of images, including handprints, complex geometric designs, and simplistic drawings of plants, animals, and humans. A wide range of animals were depicted, including deer, tapir, crocodile, bats, monkeys, turtles, snakes, porcupines, and even extinct megafauna, including a giant sloth, a mastodon, and a horse. Humans were drawn as part of ritual and hunting scenes. Interestingly, the art at Lindosa resembles that of Pedra Pintada and several other sites in the Amazon and central Brazil. This rock art style apparently became widespread across eastern South America during the final Pleistocene and early Holocene. The range of images found at Lindosa reflects the diversity of the environment encountered by the first Amazonians. In this way, the oldest American art differs notably from that of Africa, Europe, and Sahul, whereas the oldest representational rock art of the Old World tended to focus on large, naturalistic depictions of a few prominent animals, such as bison in Europe, aurochs in Egypt, pigs in Sulawesi, and kangaroo in Australia. The oldest South American rock art depicted many different animals using stylized small drawings alongside a complex array of other motifs. It seems that in the way early South Americans made sense of the world, large animals played a more limited role than they did for Upper Paleolithic Europeans. By 12,000 years ago, right on the brink of the Holocene, a wide range of clearly distinct human cultures had emerged across South America. From the Amazon to the savannas of central Brazil, to the cold steppe of Patagonia, to the mountain plateaus of the Andes and the narrow plain of the Pacific coast, traditions had diverged from those of the first inhabitants of the continent. This transition coincided with a process of settling in. Hunting and gathering practices, technologies, and rituals were becoming established that would last for thousands of years. The first rapid migrations across the continent were over. The once minuscule human population was growing, and local groups were forging new, long-lasting identities. In our next episode, we will explore the topic of megafauna extinctions. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider becoming a patron of the show. Your support will allow me to continue bringing you our prehistory.